Welcome for the first panel of this afternoon. We have the privilege to welcome two speakers, one from academia, another one from practice. And I hope that it will be a very great debate, very fruitful. So our panel is called Challenges. And the first speaker of this panel is Professor Tomasz Koncewicz, if I may, Tomasz. So Tomasz is a professor of law and director of the Department of European and Comparative Law at the University of Gdańsk in Poland. Tomasz is also currently affiliated to Fernand Braudel Senior Fellow at the EUI in Florence, European University Institute. You are also the principal investigator of quite an interesting project that is called Reconciling Europe with its Citizens through Democracy and the Rule of Law, Reconnect. So very interesting. And you were also a fellow at Princeton last year, if I'm not mistaken. And Tomasz served as a référendaire at the Court of Justice of the European Union. So we will have a very legal perspective to the European integration, and the presentation by Tomasz today is thinking about first principle of the European legal order of dreams, hopes, votes, and one journey. You have the floor. Thank you.
Hello. Let me start by thanking, and that will be the only part of my presentation actually delivered in French, and then I will switch, with your kind permission, to English. Mesdames et messieurs, je voudrais exprimer mes sentiments des appréciations pour l'invitation de vous joindre ici. Tout d'abord, je remercie mon ami, professeur Bettina Humer-Cahill, ancien doyen de la faculté du droit à l'Université de Lausanne, et monsieur Gilles Grain de la Fondation Jean Monnet. Le fait que cette colloque est organisée sous les auspices de la Fondation Jean Monnet a de l'importance particulière pour moi, parce que c'est exactement la sagesse et l'enthousiasme européen de Jean Monnet dont on a besoin aujourd'hui. Selon Jean Monnet, like all practical systems, the community cannot prevent problems arising, but it offers a framework and a means for solving them peacefully. That is a fundamental change by comparison with the past, the very recent past. Pour moi, ce sont les mots très importants parce que mon argument qui suit est informé par ces mots. Et si vous me permettez, je voudrais passer du français vers l'anglais. Merci pour votre compréhension. Alors, let me now start with more personal remarks. Two personal remarks. When I was appointed a referendar in the Court of Justice in 2004, it was a great feeling of closure for Polish people, for me personally, feeling of enthusiasm, feeling of fulfillment. And it was 2004. Then fast forward to 2018, and right now I am chief trader of the Polish people. My computer has been hacked 5 times since 2015. And when I was in Princeton, after publishing an op-ed for the Jerusalem Post about the politics of mismemory in Poland, my American cell phone has been hacked. And I lost 75% of my data, photos, PDFs. So what a difference 15 years make. And this is really important because I want to go beyond the legal in my short speech, and I want to ask more fundamental questions. First of all, are we, the European peoples, still ready to paddle together despite all the differences? Are we still united in the project and certain fundamental principles that brought us together in the 50s? That's the question mark. And secondly, my talk is a rallying cry for more Europe on the inside. Europe dans le monde will speak forcefully to the world, only if it has a credibility to deliver on the promise of what I call the first principles of the European legal order. And there are two overarching themes of my speech. First of all, when I was preparing for the speech, I reminded myself of words that my good colleague, former president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aharon Barak, once told me. Tomasz, you have to remember, if something like that happened in the country of Goethe and Beethoven, it can happen anywhere. So that's my first overarching theme. And then secondly, my presentation asked the question, why to carry on with the European project? Because I have the impression that the question how dominated our discussion for too long. How is important, make no mistake about it. But why, faced with the crisis, the rule of law crisis, the democracy crisis in some of the member states, takes on a special importance. And the structure of my argument looks the following. First of all, I would like to move beyond the populism talk. It is a dangerous concept that is over-inclusive. It can mean anything to anybody. If you make an argument for a populist and you call somebody a populist, you think that's the person that believes in the politics of protest, that is somebody who's against the status quo. But then Bernie Sanders would be a populist. So for somebody to be called populism, you need to have more, and that will be my first part. Then the first principles of the European legal order. I want to look back on the question why the member states came together in the 50s, last century. Then I will make a claim that with the first principles firmly in place, Europe is in a paradoxical situation that it is not able to defend the very principles that informed the integration in the first place. Because Europe was not structured to defend the rule of law and democracy at the level of a member state. Why? Because there was an assumption that the European integration will be a celebration of liberal democracy. Nobody thought back then there would be someday an illiberal state among the European states forming part of the European Union. So that's number three. Number four, I will say a few words about the current treaty framework to deal with the rising politics of resentment. And finally, I want to move beyond lawyers' heads and ask the question, when we agree that the European Union should enforce the rule of law, the more fundamental question is, in the name of whom? And my answer is, in the name of the European citizens. But for that to happen, we need to build a civic register. We cannot create yet another institution that will deal with the rule of law protection. Because as the old saying goes, when European Union has a problem, it creates a new institution. And I agree. So we need to invest more in the civic register. So what are my boats? My boats are Poland and Hungary. The legal authoritarianism that swept across those two countries is very, very scary because it deals a deadly blow to some of the basic principles of the European integration that I will come back to in a second. And my journey is an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. And we have to remember that this phrase has been in the treaties since the very inception, from the preamble and now Article 1 of the Treaty on the European Union. So, first part, why populism is over-inclusive. What we know, exclusion and distrust of the other, anti-pluralism, exclusivity of representation. I, and only I, speak in the name of the real people. Politics of fear, we accept only those who look like me. We all know that. That's the most basic claim behind the populist narrative. But I want to move behind that. That's not enough. So the new term that I would propose is the politics of resentment. And you have to make a clear distinction between, on the one hand, the demand side, the politics of emotions. I am so fed up with the elites. I am so fed up with the status quo. And normally the analysis ends here. I want to add another dimension, the demand side. The question is, what do you do on the emotions that people like me express. And the politics of resentment deliver on the supply side. How do they do it? Because the leaders who claim that they are populist move beyond the politics of emotions and claim this. Those are the people that have been doing this to you for generations. And I, the righteous leader, will put you back where you belong. The real Pole, the real Hungarian. So the supply side tells us what the leaders, once in power, will do with the emotions, incoherent emotions of the people. So politics of resentment in Poland and Hungary moves well beyond the populism talk, because it is translating resentment and emotions into a constitutional doctrine. What are the main elements of the constitutional doctrine behind the politics of resentment? And it is important to bear these in mind, because then the first principles will be contrasted with the propositions behind the politics of resentment. First of all, there is a new understanding of the Constitution. The Constitution no longer protects the people, the human rights, the rule of law, the liberal element of the state. The Constitution is a political expression of the uniqueness of a state that has adopted the Constitution. Secondly, the law equals majority, and majority understood in a very aggressive terms. The honorary speaker of the Polish parliament, by the way, father of our current prime minister, said this in 2015: the will of the people is above the law. The law must serve the people. If it does not, it is no longer law. And I will ask you a question. Do you know where this quotation comes from? This comes from the famous treatise of Hans Frank, published in 1936, about the fundamentals of Nazi law. He quoted from that book. So the law is what the people want the law to be. Number 3, primacy of politics over law and the political over the legal. There is a new kind of political conflict. Conflict is something natural for democracy, but with the politics of resentment, the political adversaries become my enemies who do not have claim to representation. They will never be able to represent the people as I do. So they are excluded from the democratic politics. What are constitutional forts? Number 5. They are transformed from a constitutional constraint on the political power into a government enabler. And we've seen in Poland how this works in practice. So constitutional court in the politics of resentment no longer checks the power, it enables the power. No longer tames the politics, it helps the politics. Number 6, rule of law. With the politics of resentment, rule of law, one of the basic principles of the European legal space is understood completely differently. It facilitates the expression of the will of the people and is seen as an obstacle in protecting the collectivity. Rule of law is a mechanism that serves the elites, not the real people. Checks on power and the rights of the opposition are seen as constraints on the true will of the people. There is a growing suspicion of international institutions and courts, especially. The most hated institution in Poland right now is the Court of Justice and its president, Kun Lenartz. Why? Because the narrative goes, those faceless judges will not dictate, proud Poles, what the law should look like or what the law should provide. Collectivity, community, takes precedence over individual citizen. And finally, human rights take backstage to the interest of an ethnocultural community. So the question is, with those 10 elements, how do they stack against the promised dream of Europe? And there are a few elements that I would like to bring your attention to. The paradigm of integration is that the member states were willing to learn from the past. There was a belief that democracy will be rebuilt through law on the ashes of post-war Europe. And the post-45 sentiment of trust in the law was reinforced in 1989. The law will help us rebuild democracy in post-communist states the same way it was able to do it in the post-war Europe. Constitutional democracy rests on shared set of values. Member states that came together recognized this, that certain essentials binds us together and allows us to form this community. Commonality of values that bind us together, and then the challenge of finding the right fit. It was not just about commonality, because commonality expresses trust. But European integration at its beginning was as much about distrust. Why? Because Europe was living in the long shadow of the atrocities. We have seen what nation states could do to each other when unchecked. And that's why there was a new ethos of membership. What does this ethos of membership stand for? There's a special attitude towards the other actors. The community is more than the sum of its parts. Member states owe a special duty of fidelity to the new legal order. So it's not just a member state against a member state. It's about a community institution representing the European public order against a member state. Number 6, one of the driving forces behind European integration was what I called never again constitutionalism. And there are four basic elements of this never again constitutionalism. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Go back now to the politics of resentment. Fundamental rights deserve protection no matter who governs at any given time. Separation of powers is one of the fundamental structural principles of new European governance. And finally, supranational adjudication, European Court of Human Rights, European Court of Justice would provide an extra checks on the political power at the domestic level. Number 7, Europe was always seen as a powerful no to the democracy of the polls. We have seen what majoritarian democracies under the mask of law can do. Political power was always to be constrained by law. But not only that, it was constrained from the outside by the creation of independent institutions. And integration was always seen as interdependence and contestation. And finally, European Union, understood as a process, not the final destination, has been always about providing this platform for managing differences between member states and trying to arrive at a compromise that would be possible and that would be acceptable to those very states. So we have the politics of resentment on the one hand, and then the first principles of the European legal order. The question looms large. So what about Europe? And my claim is this, that the crisis of the rule of law and democracy in any member state, right now Poland and Hungary, affects the very profile of those member states. We are not talking about yet another recalcitrant member state that violates certain technical norms of European integration. We are dealing with a fundamentally different member state in terms of constitutional profile. So what can the EU do about it then? My argument is it can do some, but not much. Why? Because the European constitutional design is in error. Constitutional design of any community is in error where it protects against the dangers that no longer exist, or it fails to protect against dangers not contemplated by the framing document. And this is where the European constitutional design fails. European treaties have not been built to protect against dangers like the rule of law crisis, democracy crisis, that are systematic in nature. Europe was based on the assumption that all the member states will be always good enough. And Poland and Hungary are dramatically changing this paradigm. So what is this design in error? How does it look like in practice? So Article 2, we were talking about the universal values in the morning. Article 2 states that there are certain values that are shared among the member states: rule of law, fundamental rights, democracy. Article 2, as it stands together, is a counterfactual provision. There are member states that no longer share those values. If that's not a crisis, then tell me what it is. Relying on Article 2, then, is used to distill some guidance with regard to the values that used to be shared by the member states, but no longer they are. And democracy pre-accession was guaranteed during the conditionality process, and it was thought that it would be enough to secure democracy in countries like Hungary, Poland, and other Eastern European countries long term. But once a member state wakes up as a member state of the European Union, there's not much the EU can do, even though pre-accession it had those powerful instruments to enforce the first principles of the European legal order. So what then happens to the presumptions that inform the process of European integration? So those are question marks, and I invite you to answer those questions for yourself. So in my understanding, with the politics of resentment, European Union is no longer understood, or should not longer be understood, as a celebration of liberal democracies. Common values, no longer shared? Yes, no longer shared. Authority of law that binds states together? No more. Because for the first time in the history of European integration, Poland has been repeatedly rejecting the authority of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, saying that those decisions are not binding on us. It has never ever happened before. So one court for all the member states? Not anymore. Mutual trust? No more. Democratic consolidation, irrevocable and linear. The presumption in 2004 was that the new democracies of Eastern Europe will always remain democracies, that there will be no backsliding. Once you progress to another stage, democratization, there is no going back to the previous state of authoritarianism. And right now we are dealing with exactly this situation. Member states are backsliding to the previous state of, let's call it a nature. Like authoritarianism comes roaring back, and Poland and Hungary are the prime examples of this vanishing presumption. So what can be done then on the basis of the treaties that we have? So my project in Florence as Braudel Fellow is about what I called existential jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice, and ask the following question. To what extent the court, in collaboration with the Commission, can prevent the democratic backsliding from progressing at the level of a member state? Existential, because it stands for the fundamentals of the European legal order. So there are two exits that we are facing in Europe right now. On the one hand, political exit that has already happened. The ship has already sailed on the political. Right now, we are entering a new phase of exit, legal. The question is, can the institutions do something about it despite this constitutional design in error? And there are signs from the European Court of Justice that actually it is ready to step in and prevent democratic backsliding from spreading. How does it happen? Well, for the first time since insertion of Article 2 into the treaties, the court says that there is a general obligation on the part of the member states to guarantee judicial independence of national courts. And this obligation is directly based on Article 2 of the treaties. 5 years ago, all members of the academia were in agreement. Article 2 is not enforceable. It's a political statement. The court said no last year. It said no. Article 2 will be enforced before the European courts, and Article 2 contains the rule of law, and the element of the rule of law is the judicial independence of the member state judiciary. The question is, with this rising existential jurisprudence, the question is, can the court deliver by itself, or will it need some help? Definitely it will need some help from the political branch of the EU government. And we are seeing that happening right now, even though the process and the responses from the Commission are still very, very, very hesitant. But the court will need the Commission to enforce its decisions in practice. So, I'm wrapping up.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we are running out of time. 1 minute.
1 minute. So,
all your time. It's very meaningful. Yeah, take your time.
So the politics of resentment, you know, vox populi. But in the right sense of the word. So the politics of resentment, unconstitutional capture in Europe. The question that I would like to ask you is, are we really facing the challenge of thinking the unthinkable? And I would say yes. What are those unthinkable things? First of all, liberal constitutionalism no longer animates national constitutions. Secondly, there is a possibility and danger of an unconstitutional constitution within the EU, where the unconstitutionality is evaluated from the perspective of EU parameters. So the constitution might be constitutional in the domestic sense, but with the growing awareness from the European institutions, with the rule of law as the first principle, the independence of the judiciary as the first principle, those are the procedural benchmarks for knowing whether the domestic constitution is constitutional from the external perspective. So this is something absolutely unthinkable. Pouvoir constituant, member states as the masters of the treaties. Yes, but as a result of the rule of law crisis, member states are still masters of the treaties with one important addition. Masters of the treaties bound by the European rule of law. Finally, what about lawyers? People like me. So, the challenges are many and they are fundamental. So, what the Commission has done wrong in the Polish case, that for the 2 years it's been engaging with the Polish government, talking and talking and talking, while the government got all the precious time to take over the state and the institutions. So the lesson is, the European institutions must act preemptively, because the new autocrats need time, and the Commission was more than willing to give Poland as much time as Poland needed. The most important lesson, though, for me, is that we lawyers and the European public must change or recalibrate the perspective. The new authoritarians, like Kaczynski and Orban, they do not come with the tanks in the streets and with the generals. Quite the contrary. They use the smart lawyers and attack the constitutional document with sophisticated constitutional amendments. So the law is used to kill the law. The law is used to kill the institutions. And everything happens under the mask of law. So that's why the Commission missed the boat. Because on the face of it, everything was fine. Do we still have a constitutional court in Poland? Yes, it's even in the same building. Is it the same institution, the liberal institution that puts checks on power? Not anymore. The liberal heart of the Constitutional Court of Poland has been ripped out, with the Commission watching and standing by. So, finally, going beyond lawyers' heads, and I promise this is my last point. Yes, this is all very important, the institutional response, but that's not enough. We have to make a dramatic shift from the domestic rule of law to the European community of law. We have to build a civic register The habits of European heart are a necessary complement to any well-designed constitution at the level of the EU. No matter how many institutions the EU will create, it will never be enough if actually people in Netherlands, in Luxembourg, will not understand that actually Polish rule of law is my rule of law as well. So the civic register is missing at the moment. Going beyond lawyers' hats is finally about asking the right questions. And I want to leave you with those questions to take you out of your comfort zone. When will how meet why? So when will how to enforce the rule of law will be complemented by why to enforce the European rule of law in the first place. Whose rule of law? Faceless bureaucrats from Brussels? No, my rule of law. Rule of law that protects European citizens against the oppressiveness of their own state. Fallacy of the enforcement. Yes, we cannot put too much trust in the European institutions doing all the dirty work for us. The enforcement is important, but we, the peoples of Europe, have to understand why the enforcement is happening at the level of the EU. And finally, in the name of whom? In the name of the European citizens. And one of the motto of Juncker's Commission is Europe that protects. It's not enough, because we need to make a switch from Europe that protects, from having EU rights, to protect EU citizens from their own state of nationality. There is a growing expectation on the part of many Poles that the EU should be doing more. And the European Union doing not enough is not a neutral decision. It will take the European Union project down because people in Poland will be feeling disappointed that the EU was not able to deliver on the promise of the European first principles. So finally, what is the journey that my title speaks of? I go back as a former referendar of the European Court of Justice to the most famous decision of the court in Van Handen Loos. The court spoke of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe and more. It looked at the EU law as a law of nationals, institutions, and states. And one last sentence, Mark Twain once said, history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. And before our very eyes, we see how the past experiences do a pretty damaging process of rhyming. Let us stand together and finally do something. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tomasz, for this final appeal. So let me introduce our second panelist, Mrs. Annika Brack. You are a head of community development for regional agenda focusing on Europe at the World Economic Forum, and you are managing with the EU institution and Germany within the World Economic Forum since 2013. Before that, you were working for energy sector and also for German politics. And also, while you were working for energy sector, you found it, I found it very interesting that you founded a Women in Energy Roundtable. So the floor is yours, and you will speak about what's next for Europe and the perspective from the World Economic Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will speak about everything but energy today, so to tell you. I understood when I looked at the room why this panel is called Challenges, because you are invited to speak about the world order, and then you fill the room with seasoned diplomats. So luckily I can hide behind world-leading thinkers that we work with at the World Economic Forum. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making it here on a Friday afternoon. So challenges for Europe. 2019 arguably bears many challenges for Europe. We're all afraid of the parliamentary elections and the expected populist surge that could block EU policy, the ongoing Brexit chaos, and Europe seems to be consumed by domestic issues when at a time where there's a lot of international uncertainty. And we are also entering a new era of globalization, as we observe at the World Economic Forum. But I want to say that 2019 is also a year of opportunity. We see a change of institutional leadership in almost all EU institutions. It's a moment where we can redefine the political and the economic agenda at the EU level. So we at the World Economic Forum try to use this moment by convening thought leaders, political practitioners, and economic leaders to think about a possible agenda for the incoming European Commission and also other institutions. And I'm going to give you an insight of their latest output today, and you can also read more after my intervention. And the idea is to input on the agenda throughout the year. So we've been recognized as an international organization for public-private cooperation, and we like to say that we're a neutral platform, inviting everybody to like a multi-stakeholder, but also multi-conceptual place to discuss world affairs. But there's one place where we are really not neutral, and that is the world order has to be multilateral and collaborative. And this is where we see also a special responsibility for Europe to advocate a rules-based multilateral world order. And I'm going to come back to that in my presentation. I'd like to first sketch out 3 challenges that are in fact universal, but that affect Europe, of course. So the first is a changing world order and Europe's place in it. The second is a changing economic order, the 4th industrial revolution. And the third would be uncertainty within societies in transition. And before I start, let me just take a bit of water. I'm sorry. So Europe, a changing world order, and what is Europe's place? So Europe is the expression of a multilateral, rules-based, value-driven and collaborative and democratic world order. But the world, however, seems to be moving in a different direction, and you argue even the continent itself. So we can see that the US presidency also undermines somehow this established idea of Europe being part of a larger transatlantic community of shared values and beliefs. And we also see the key international players at the moment, when you look at Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Erdogan, they are not necessarily based in liberal democratic states or free markets. So what we observe is a multipolar world order where regional powers assert themselves, and also a more and more multi-conceptual world order. We can no longer assume that we somehow converge towards liberal democratic democracy, which is something that was a comfortable belief in the post-Cold War era, and I think found its expression in Fukuyama's writings. And also, we have to see that the future key players in both politics and economics, they may not be rooted in democracy, and they may not be rooted in free markets. So how do we deal with that, and what should Europe do? This new world order also brings a lot of uncertainties. So in Davos, the panels typically are entitled at the moment, Geopolitics is Back. The international competition has returned. So after a seemingly quiet period. The problem with Europe at present is that we see Europe is busy with itself. It is very busy addressing domestic challenges instead of thinking forward and thinking about the massive external challenges that present itself. I think the worst example is Brexit, and I found the EU summit, its very expression last week, when China was on the agenda, and again, everybody was very consumed with Brexit, and there was no sensible outcome. So coming to China and its expansionist Silk Road policies, this happens at a time where Europe is really turned inwards, focused on own and sometimes self-created problems. So thought leaders that we work with, they warn that a moralistic and internationalist worldview is no longer enough. Europe has to assert itself, it has to adopt a more strategic and pragmatic approach to politics. Here again, I found the latest Macron-Xi Jinping meeting very interesting, where he pulled in Merkel and Juncker for two reasons. One is that it shows maybe a new style of politics where you focus on business only and try to leave this human rights questions a bit out of the picture. You can't bring it in every conversation. You said there are fora to discuss human rights, there are fora to discuss, there are moments to discuss business. That was one interesting thing. The other thing was that even key member states of the European Union see that they're no longer enough to operate and negotiate at the international level. Europeans need to pool resources, they need to work together to compete and to prevail at the international level. So now you could say, yes, but political integration at the moment, it doesn't seem to be the first thing that Europeans are thinking about. But polls do show that there's appetite for further economic integration and there's appetite for further defense integration, because one of the key concerns currently in Europe or European citizens that we found is security. Defense, we had a discussion a year ago. We published a report, Renew Europe, and we put a very diverse group of people from very different parties and backgrounds together. Also, we work with populists as well, as you can see also in the paper that I will share afterwards. And I thought we would never achieve to write a chapter on migration, for instance, but there was consensus that if we deal with the external security, we can also manage to find answers on how to deal with migration internally. So that is one. And then economics, of course, integration is really important because economic weight confers political influence. So we at the World Economic Forum currently observe a new battle for economic leadership and a shift of economic gravity towards the east, towards China. And this leads me to the second biggest challenge, which is the fourth industrial revolution and the new era of globalization. The fourth industrial revolution, 4IR, is a term that we coined to capture the rapid technological change that we are currently experiencing. It profoundly transforms the global economy. It affects the way we live, the way we relate to each other, and also the way we work, of course. So given the sheer scale of change, we speak of an industrial revolution. You could, of course, argue we're still part of in the third industrial revolution, in the information age and computerization, but we do call it a fourth because we observe an exponential rather than linear change. And it is disrupting almost every industry and society. We see that it brings enormous opportunity, but it of course also challenges the post-war governance models, our social fabric, and broad-based prosperity creation. Europe has outstanding industrial assets, but it hasn't been able to leverage them in the fourth industrial revolution the same way as other continents have. And as I already said, we observe a battle over economic leadership, especially between the United States and China. And current trends indicate that Europe as an economic bloc will remain one of the key players in the future, but its share of global GDP will decrease dramatically. So it goes from roughly 30% in 1995 to about half of it in 2030. So there is an urgency to act and to keep this economic weight. And the key factor for Europe that it is struggling is really that we still don't have a single market. European member states will be less and less able to compete internationally if they do their own thing. And I've worked with a number of startup entrepreneurs and investors to discuss this question in practice, and they say that day-to-day reality is fragmented legal frameworks, geographically focused access to finance, its cultural barriers, and a lack of talent mobility. So less than 19% of startup employees are actually from other European countries. And only about 16% have founded in startup outside their own country. So what we observe is people, also the new generation, they usually found very locally, and they found for their local markets. Now, globalization allows to scale operations at unprecedented levels. It has this opportunity, but in order to harvest that opportunity, you need to think global from the outset. That's why we advocate a pan-European approach to innovation, for instance. In Europe, Europe should complement, the member states should complement each other rather than to compete. So what we observe is that local ecosystems try to emulate Silicon Valley, they try to build up another Berlin, but this is not a very good approach when everyone has different assets, and they should just work together. So public funding, for instance, is often focused on keeping startups where they are and founders where they are, instead of bringing them to the next place where they can actually scale their operations. So that is a mindset that is slowly changing, but that still needs, requires, I think, an institutional push, maybe from the incoming European Commission. It requires a positive narrative about the opportunities of this fourth industrial revolution. In terms of innovation, Europe's share of knowledge output, so the numbers of researchers and patents and so on, they see a rapid decline compared to China. This is also true for investments in future technologies like artificial intelligence. Most of it goes to the US and to China. And we observe that in a number of economic indicators that the center of economic gravity is shifting towards the east, with China becoming a more and more important player. And this means, of course, that trade centers, trade channels will also recenter and make transatlantic trade less important than the trade with China for both US and Europe. So we have a lot of new alliances and battles happening at the very moment. China is making headway with agreements in Europe. They have concluded agreements with 14 member states, the latest addition being Italy. It is with its Belt and Road Initiative. And again, I'd like to quote a French tech investor, Nicolas Collin, who also points out that this will help Chinese tech giants to also expand globally and also in Europe. And it will arguably, the Road and Belt Initiative, that the infrastructure will help also the tech giants to gain ground, and that there will eventually be a battle of US and Chinese tech giants over shares of the European market if we don't manage to build big players, big enough to compete at their level. So I think for the new Commission, it's an important task to formulate and to operationalize an ambition on how to achieve global innovation leadership and how to strengthen Europe's economic clout. And so I mentioned that this fourth industrial revolution has a political dimension, and it is also about ensuring that the big players and the big economic players of the future stay rooted in a democratic and multilateral system. So my third challenge is the uncertainty within societies in transition. Robin Niblett, the head of Chatham House, put it this way: he said European societies are under stress. There are two major rifts in Europe, or two major fractures. One is amongst euro area countries, a north and south divide in the Eurozone. It was traumatic. The sovereign debt crisis ruined the relationship between the north and the south, and it was traumatic for the young generations who experienced soaring unemployment rates and, in fact, a lost decade. And I think there's also a lot of resentment from the south, while northern countries feel there's a lot of transfers going on to the south. So this is clearly an unaddressed fracture between the north and the south. And then the second big rift is amongst citizens. So the change brought by the technological progress that I described earlier is deeply unsettling because it's turbocharged by globalization. We find ourselves in an economy that disrupts whole industries and that demands a lot of flexibility from every one of us, and rising economic insecurity for the individual. So we're moving we're moving to a place of much greater uncertainty compared to the promise of ever greater stability of the post-war era. And there's a rift between those who adapt well to these changes and those who feel left behind or feel the political institutions are losing control. And in fact, the Brexiteers campaign was around this slogan of taking back control. So also coming back to populism, that is also very much on your mind, that I didn't call this section populism as a challenge, because populism is a symptom of unaddressed challenges. The more complex and interconnected our world becomes, the more attractive are simple answers and the idea to be able to retreat somehow from globalization or regional integration. So we believe and we see in the at the World Economic Forum that we are somehow in a transition period where political institutions yet have to adapt to the change that is happening. And we've seen this in former industrial revolutions. It was exactly the same way. So it gives us hope that we will actually be able to find answers. But these answers, since the challenges are universal, they have to be global. So let me conclude by saying that a key task for the EU institutions in 2019, according to the work that we've been doing, is really to address the fractures affecting its societies, the North-South, the people who feel left behind, and to work hard to rebuild trust in the effectiveness of democratic governance. And 2019 could bear this opportunity just because we are experiencing a major backlash and because we are in a crisis of democratic institutions. It might actually allow us to come out of this felt political inertia. And the thought leaders of the what we call the Global Future Council on Europe, they are actually calling on for a European Bretton Woods. So in the paper that I can share, the German economist Beatrice Weder Di Mauro and the Dutch politician Jeroen Dijsselbloem, they actually explain this further and have a whole agenda for it. But they say actually Europe should now use the time to put in a grand gesture and to start anew and bring some positive momentum. And I'd like to I'd like to just say I hope that Europe will be able to do this. It has been absent and very busy with domestic issues at a time where its voice on the international scene would be needed more than ever. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both panelists for those very interesting presentations, but quite different, but with overlapping subjects that I would like to highlight. Both of you were talking about more Europe from inside in order to have more united representation from the outside. Actually, there is, I think, and it was also your point, the overlapping tensions from inside and from outside, because Brexit populists cannot be just only dealt with in European Union level. It has to be also dealt on the external level. So maybe you can just also react on this systemic overlapping of crises that can influence the internal and external unity of the European Union. Also, in terms of more politics within the European integration, I might a bit disagree with the point that you made regarding the ECJ, the European Court of Justice. Actually, yes, the work between the European Court of Justice and the Commission is very important, but I think the much more important dialogue that the Court of Justice is exercising is with national courts. Actually, national courts from different member states of the European Union, they have the possibility to ask questions to the ECJ. And all the ECJ opinions are binding. We are very we know this problematic from Swiss perspective because of these institutional agreements, but from the internal unity of the European Union, it might be a very interesting point. And also when you're talking about this law that is destroying a bit the integration because the nature of law is changing. Yes, but could you please develop a bit more on this, because the topic is very interesting. I don't want to monopolize my position, so the floor is open for questions from the public, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask Tomasz, who makes European Union law?
Maybe we can take another question just here. Yeah,
okay.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Just briefly, even if the subject is very complicated, thank you very much for both your presentations, reminding the importance of law in building the European Union that we know is fundamental, because law has had an enormous power of innovation. And this brings me to a particular element that has not been cited. In 1979, we elected for the first time directly the European Parliament. That kind of innovation that gave representativeness, direct representativeness to that institution, allowed other conquests in the following years. I am convinced that we do have a euro currency of that kind, so strong, so devoted to protect European citizens, because the European Parliament was elected. Before that turning point, the monetary policy was just coordination, not convergence. Without citing, I suppose, and this might be a question not only for the panel, but also for the top representatives of that institutions, that we can refer to the European Parliament more than to the European Commission to play an increasingly important role. The Parliament itself is debating about its function in the next forthcoming years. The Parliament is discussing about transnational lists in order to give transnational representation, and so on. But most of all, we can ask the Parliament to act as a Parliament that has got a majority and a minority that clashes on very important issues and defends democracy and values. Isn't that so? More the Parliament than the Commission? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So this time I will really be brief, so don't worry. So I can sense a trap in the question who makes the EU law, because it's pretty obvious. On its face, it's pretty obvious. The EU law is made by the European institutions, but the EU law at all times should represent a myriad of interests, those of member states, those of the institutions, and finally, those of the European public interest. That's the ideal. But the important question is whether the institutions as lawmakers, the institutions at the EU level as lawmakers, are really appreciated enough by the member states. And let me explain this to you. So when I use the metaphor journey, I would say that in the European project, there are two journeys. Member states complete their journey when they sign the treaties. They give the framework, they give the platform, and they create institutions to fill in the blank spaces that they were not ready to agree on, and they give necessarily certain discretion to the European institutions to complement the traité cadre that the treaties have always been. So the journey of the member states is completed with the signing of the treaties. It's not finished, but this is their journey that ends at the signing of the treaty. And another journey starts on this very day, and this is the journey of the European institutions. Let me ask you a question. Were the goods defined in the original treaties? Were the services defined? The right of establishment? Discrimination? No. It was an open-ended project that called on the institutions to step in and deliver on the promise of those open-ended institutions. And contestation of whether the choices made by the European institutions will be always there. Because European integration is about integration and contestation. And the search for this elusive balance between the two will never end. On the ECJ and national courts and political institutions, I'm not sure how many of you remember what was the reaction of the European Commission when the ECJ gave its fundamental order, interim injunction order, in the so-called Białowieża forest case. Białowieża forest is the last primeval forest in Europe. And the Polish government started a very extensive process of logging the trees. The court said stop for the duration of the proceedings because there's a strong prima facie case that you might be violating the binding EU law. And it said, if you don't stop for the duration of the proceedings, if the logging continues, the Commission will be allowed to come back to the court and ask for the financial penalty to the tune of 100,000 euros per day of the illegal activity. The question is now, what did the Commission do after this bold, brave, imaginative decision by the ECJ? It did nothing. It never returned to the court, even though everybody knew that the logging not only continued, but intensified in the face of the ECJ's order. So my point during the presentation was that the court needs the Commission. The court needs the Commission to feed the court with new cases, to frame arguments accordingly, to use those open-ended provisions like Article 2, Article 19, but the important thing is that the court can only do so much acting alone. It's a joint collaborative process. ECJ plus the Commission. And of course, ECJ and national courts, yes, I agree completely. This is part of the existential jurisprudence. I skipped that part because I was running short on time. But you see how the politics of resentment work as a sword. So peace government knows all too well that with the Polish judges asking questions to the ECJ, that poses an existential threat to the politics of resentment, because there is a dramatic switch in the dynamics from the political to the legal. And in the courtroom, you have a different set of arguments. Each judge has one vote. Poland can only do so much by rejecting the authority of the court. The dynamics are changed because the court responds to questions posed by national courts. And right now, the case pending before the so-called Polish Constitutional Court is a first step to poll exit, because peace government has just claimed that the preliminary ruling procedure, which gives a right to each national court to ask a question to the ECJ, is unconstitutional. So the peace government wants to take the most fundamental legal provision of the treaties out of it, out of the game, because they have realized the potential of ECJ cooperating with national judges. European Parliament. Well, I would ask you the question. So where was the European Parliament when the Commission failed to act? To my understanding, as a lawyer, there is an action for failure to act in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So try it. As long as you don't try, you never know what the result will be. But the Commission should have felt more pressure from the European Parliament. But everything boiled down to the political process of Article 7. There are legal instruments, but there must be a political will to use those legal instruments. At least try and then see what happens.
Thank you. Would you like to
maybe just on the European Parliament? It's true, I also only mentioned the European Commission, and it's true that the European Parliament is a very important institution. It is also a political melting pot. I think they have more experience dealing with populist parties than any other country, and for longer already. And it plays an incredibly important role at changing EU legislation according to what citizens actually need. So I do think the legislative process is very, very important. And we work with a number of European MEPs, and I'm always amazed at how specialized and incredibly engaged they are.
Thank you very much. Maybe the last set of questions here on the first. Thank you.
Thank you. A small only clarification, with all due respect, I'm not a lawyer, but in the European system, the legislators are member states and the parliament. This is not that the institutions are legislating. Institutions are guardians of the treaties. Therefore, the claims that institutions did not do enough in order to ensure enforcement of the law is legitimate. But the laws and regulations are adopted by the Council, which means member states and the Parliament together. But I wanted to turn to Annika Brack's challenges for the future. Among these challenges, one challenge is missing: European citizens, European demography. Europe is a vanishing continent. And if we are confronted with a demographic pressure of one Africa, where the average age of people is less than 25 years, and we are over 45 years in average in Europe, then we are lost in this competition. We may prepare the European clouding, we may prepare a European innovative hub, but for whom? The question, the demographic question, is a very legitimate question for Europe.
Thank you very much. Je vais peut-être changer en français, même si les orateurs ont parlé en anglais. En tant qu'ambassadeur de l'Union européenne en Suisse, je voudrais quand même dire que sous le titre Challenges ou défis, c'est vrai que l'Union européenne a beaucoup de défis, mais comme ça a été rappelé hier soir par le président Gilles Robles, et je crois que le directeur Grain peut le confirmer aussi, l'Europe avance, l'Union européenne a avancé grâce aux défis. C'est quand il y a des défis qu'on trouve des solutions. Ça a été aussi rappelé par le président Pat Cox hier soir. Donc oui, l'Union européenne a des défis, mais nous ne sommes pas les seuls à avoir des défis dans le monde. Et je crois aussi que c'est important quand j'ai entendu Andy Brack dire qu'on se concentre seulement sur ce qui se passe à l'intérieur, c'est vrai que le Brexit demande beaucoup de ressources et d'énergie et qu'on regarde tous notre téléphone pour voir ce qui se passe maintenant à Londres, mais il se passe plein d'autres choses et c'est pour ça que la décision avait été prise de demander à M. Barnier, à la Task Force 50, de s'occuper du Brexit, mais l'Union européenne continue et on se développe dans beaucoup de domaines. Oui, il se passe beaucoup de choses à l'intérieur, on a beaucoup de défis à l'intérieur, mais comme le monde bouge et qu'il y a M. Trump aux États-Unis et qu'il y a la Chine, etc., je crois qu'il ne faut pas oublier que l'Union européenne est aussi un acteur global. En même temps qu'on s'occupe des choses à l'intérieur, on a fait l'accord avec le Canada, on a fait le plus grand accord commercial avec le Japon, avec la Chine, on a fait le GDPR. Il se passe plein de choses au niveau mondial et ce qui est peut-être pas suffisamment connu, c'est qu'il y a, maintenant je vais utiliser une formule anglaise, en anglais, there's demand for Europe. Il y a beaucoup de pays, aussi parce que le système multilatéral est sous pression, qui veulent se rapprocher de l'Union européenne. Regardez les contacts entre l'Union européenne et l'Afrique. On a un partenariat avec l'Afrique, des réunions avec l'Union africaine. Je suis sûr que mon collègue de Seoul va parler de Demand for Europe en Asie, coopération avec ASEAN. Donc oui, il y a des défis à l'intérieur, il faut s'en occuper, mais on essaie aussi de s'occuper de ce qui se passe dans le monde. Dernier point qui me donne un peu d'optimisme, parce que oui, il y a des populistes, on va voir quels seront les résultats au Parlement européen au mois de mai. Si on peut croire les pronostics, peut-être qu'il y aura plus de populisme, mais ils ne vont pas avoir la majorité, je ne pense pas. Et on voit aussi des mouvements maintenant de jeunes, de Verts, d'autres groupes qui maintenant se mobilisent parce qu'ils disent maintenant ces élections sont très importantes et il faudra résister. Et les derniers chiffres de Eurostat montrent qu'on n'a jamais eu tant de citoyens dans l'Union européenne qui sont pour l'Union européenne que maintenant. Il y a peut-être une exception, c'est l'Italie, malheureusement. C'est peut-être aussi dû à la façon dont on n'a peut-être pas bien géré la crise migratoire. Mais dans beaucoup de pays, mon pays d'origine, le Danemark, 5 millions. Le Danemark est rentré avec l'Irlande et la Grande-Bretagne en 73. On n'a jamais eu tant de citoyens danois, même s'ils sont de temps en temps sceptiques, un peu comme les Suisses, et qui votent non dans nos votes populaires. Ils sont maintenant pour l'Union européenne. Et l'argument de ça, c'est que dans ce monde très turbulent qui a été décrit avec tous les défis, il vaut peut-être mieux être membre du club, être à la table, que hors du club. Et on a besoin de ce club, comme ça a été dit, pour négocier avec les États-Unis, négocier avec la Chine. Donc il y a une sorte d'effet Brexit et, je pense, Trump, qui fait que beaucoup de citoyens européens sont maintenant plus en faveur de l'Union européenne. Je voulais mettre ça pour le contexte, parce que quand on parle de défis, c'est comme ça qu'on avance, mais il faut aussi voir qu'il y a des mouvements intéressants à l'intérieur de l'Union européenne qui, j'espère, vont se manifester lors du vote pour le Parlement européen. Merci.
Thank you very much. Just a quick reaction, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. I'm so glad you mentioned this because I skipped a point in my introduction, which was to say Europe is a continent of opportunity and promise, and there's a reason that people try to migrate here and that people try to emulate what we have achieved. So I'm glad you made that point. Also, trade, of course, that you alluded to is an area that shows that the collaboration can work and that we can actually work as an economic bloc and confer quite some weight at the international level. So I couldn't agree more. On the demography point, it's a very important point, and I'm sure these three challenges are not covering all. Demography is a challenge that is equally affecting China and the US. I think they have similar challenges. Now, you've mentioned Africa, which is, of course, something that we have to deal with, and there's a lot of migratory pressure coming out of Africa, and I think I only alluded to it that Europe needs to deal with its external borders in order to protect what it has achieved internally in terms of Schengen. Yeah, let me stop here.
Tomasz, it's okay.
One second. Yeah. I would disagree. It's the member states are not the legislators in the European Union. It has been an established jurisprudence of the Court of Justice that the member states are the trustees of the common interest, and when they act within the council, it's the council that acts. That is composed of member states. That's true. That is true. But they act as an institution that is independent, that has been given powers in the treaties, but those are not member states. It is the council as an institution. 79 Commission against Italy, and it's been established ever since. Trustees of the common interest within dans le cadre du droit communautaire. I'm quoting from the decision of the court.
Merci beaucoup. On va terminer notre panel sur les défis. Et oui, vous savez que notre pause café sera légèrement plus courte, mais on se retrouve dans 15 minutes. Merci.